Before we begin, subscribe for more chilling stories and tell me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. The silent hallway. Alex had settled into his modest apartment in the heart of Chicago's bustling Wicker Park neighborhood, a place where the city's hum usually drowned out the quiet hours. But that rainy November night, he planned to burn the midnight oil on a looming project deadline, the weight of unfinished code pressing like an invisible hand on his shoulders. The old brick building, with its creaking floors and finicky wiring inherited from a bygone industrial era, had always felt like a relic from another time, whispered about by longtime residents for its odd occurrences. Lights that danced on their own without cause, echoes of footsteps from empty corridors that seemed to follow tenants home, and faint murmurs heard in the dead of night. But Alex, a pragmatic software engineer transplanted from the quiet suburbs of Evanston, dismissed such tales as urban myths born from the isolation of city living, rationalizing them away even as a seed of doubt lingered in his mind. He dimmed the lamps to a soft amber glow, brewed a pot of strong black coffee that filled the air with its bitter aroma, and sank into his worn desk chair, headphones clamped over his ears to block out the world, his laptop screen casting a pale, ethereal light across the cluttered room strewn with notebooks and half-empty mugs. The clock ticked past midnight, and an uneasy tension began to coil in his gut, as if the apartment itself had shifted imperceptibly, the air growing thicker, heavier, pressing against his skin like an unspoken accusation that stirred memories he'd long suppressed. He shook it off, attributing it to the stress of overdue work and the guilt gnawing at him from a recent fallout with his brother, harsh words exchanged over a family secret he'd kept buried for years, the theft of a cherished heirloom during their father's final days, an act driven by desperation that now festered like an open wound, fueling a paranoia that he was always one revelation away from ruin. Around 1 a.m., the hallway light outside his door flickered to life, its motion sensor triggered by nothing apparent, the soft hum of the outdated bulb seeping under the doorframe like an intruder slipping through cracks, casting elongated shadows that stretched across his faded rug. It switched off abruptly, only to ignite again moments later, casting erratic patterns that danced across his floor like fingers reaching out. Alex paused his music, ears straining against the silence, but heard no footsteps, no shuffle of neighbors returning late from shifts at nearby bars, only the distant patter of rain against the grimy windows, amplifying the oppressive quiet within the walls that suddenly felt too close, too confining. He rose slowly, peering through the peephole with a growing sense of dread, the corridor stretching empty and dim under the flickering light, lined with identical doors that seemed to stare back blankly, their brass numbers glinting like watchful eyes. Returning to his work with a forced resolve, he taped a scrap of paper over the viewer to quell the rising paranoia that clawed at his thoughts. But at 1:27 a.m., a deliberate knock echoed through the stillness. 3 measured raps, each hanging in the air like a threat, spaced with unnatural precision that evoked a buried memory of his father's stern knocks during childhood arguments, stirring a fresh wave of guilt that flushed his cheeks and tightened his throat. His heart stuttered. No one visited at this hour, not in a building where residents kept to themselves behind locked doors, and the rhythm felt personal, accusatory, as if the past had come knocking to demand reckoning. He remained still, breath held in shallow gasps, but the knocks repeated, insistent and unyielding, pulling at the edges of his composure like threads unraveling a fragile tapestry. "Who's there?" he called, voice steady but laced with an unease that betrayed him, echoing slightly in the empty room. Silence answered, broken only by a faint whisper slithering through the keyhole, undistinct at first, like wind whistling through unseen fissures, but forming fragmented words that chilled his blood. "You know what you did. Thief." Alex's mind reeled, psychological barbs hooking into old regrets, The lie he told his brother about the heirloom, the rift it caused, now manifesting as this auditory hallucination, or so he desperately told himself, even as the whispers grew more insistent, weaving guilt into paranoia that made him question his sanity. He chained the door with trembling fingers, cracking it open a mere sliver, the hallway air rushing in colder than the November night warranted, carrying a metallic tang that prickled his nostrils and evoked the scent of old blood, or perhaps the tarnished silver of the stolen item. No one stood there, yet the light remained on, buzzing faintly with an erratic rhythm, and shadows in the corners of the corridor elongated unnaturally, coiling like smoke toward his threshold, tendrils that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, reaching as if to drag him out. Closing the door with a resounding click that did little to reassure him, he checked his phone, the building security app notifying an entry door breach with an unfamiliar access code, one that didn't match any tenants, and sent a spike of fear through him, wondering if his brother had somehow discovered the truth and sent proxies. Paranoia deepened, guilt intertwining with raw terror as the whispers grew louder, now emanating from within the walls themselves, accusing in a chorus of voices that mimicked his family's. Liar, betrayer, you'll pay. He texted the neighbors group chat with shaking hands. Anyone let someone in? Strange code used downstairs. No replies came. The screen's glow mocking his isolation, but from the stairwell rose a rhythmic breathing, slow nasal inhales, controlled and deliberate, a sound that evoked surveillance from hidden watchers, making his skin crawl with the certainty of being hunted, each breath syncing with his own in a grotesque mimicry. Footsteps ascended, cautious and measured, avoiding the creaky spots he knew so well from late-night returns, halting on his landing with a final, ominous thud that vibrated through the floor. The hallway light extinguished suddenly, plunging his view into utter darkness, and Alex backed away, pulse thundering in his temples, the whispers evolving into apparitions at the edge of his vision, shadowy figures flickering in the mirror across the room, faces resembling his brother's, twisted in silent judgment, their eyes hollow voids that bored into him. Another notification buzzed on his phone. Door open, the same cryptic code flashing, suggesting reinforcements had arrived. And now two sets of breaths mingled outside, heavy and synchronized, sending chills racing up his spine like icy fingers tracing his vertebrae. He grabbed a heavy wrench from his toolbox under the sink, extinguishing his lights to merge with the enveloping shadows, the apartment transforming into a cavern of dread where every creak amplified his isolation, the rain outside now sounding like distant applause for his impending doom. Whispers pierced the door again, voices low and masculine, carrying an otherworldly echo. He senses us. The guilt binds him here. Another replied, softer but more menacing. Soon, he'll open to us. They tested the knob, a gentle rattle that set his teeth on edge and made his grip tighten on the wrench, the deadbolt holding firm against the pressure, but a metallic scrape followed, like picks probing the lock, with expert precision, blending the mundane threat of human intruders with supernatural malice. As the shadows in his room solidified, reaching tendrils toward him, whispering confessions he dared not voice aloud, guilt surging in waves that weakened his knees. Visions intensified, apparitions of his brother materializing in the gloom, translucent hands outstretched, pulling him toward the door, as if compelled by an invisible force. His own hand hovering over the chain in a moment of terrifying weakness, the boundary between psychological torment and spectral reality blurring into one inescapable nightmare.
The scrape at the luck intensified, a grating symphony that clawed at Alex's resolve, the whispers swelling into a cacophonous chorus that invaded his bots, dredging up the full weight of his deception. The stormy night he'd forged documents to claim their father's estate, pocketing the heirloom under cover of grief, the paranoia of discovery that had haunted him since, now given tangible form in these ethereal voices that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the building. He dialed emergency services with fumbling fingers, whispering his plight to the dispatcher in hushed tones that barely rose above the pounding in his ears. Intruders at the door, unnatural sounds echoing through the vents, a breach in the security system that felt orchestrated by fate itself. "Stay on the line, help is en route," she urged calmly, but outside, the men knocked again, 3 deliberate thuds that reverberated like judgments, followed by a vigorous jiggle of the handle that rattled the entire frame, testing the limits of the old wood. "Police are coming," Alex shouted through the door, his voice cracking with desperation, hoping to deter them. And the breathing shifted abruptly, becoming ragged and urgent, footsteps retreating partially down the stairs, pausing midway, as if gauging the bluff. Their hesitation allowing shadows in the room to coalesce further, supernatural apparitions taking shape, translucent forms that mimic the intruders, gliding silently through the walls, their eyes glowing with an accusatory fire that illuminated forgotten corners, murmuring indictments that echoed his inner turmoil. "Thief, alone forever, no escape from what you've done." A neighbor's door creaked open above, a gruff voice calling down into the void. "What's going on down there? You kids causing trouble again?" The intruders bolted in response, stairs thundering under their hurried descent, heavy boots echoing like retreating thunder. But the whispers lingered undeterred, seeping from vents and cracks in the plaster, promising a return that sent shivers through him, the apparitions dissolving slowly, leaving trails of cold mist that clung to his skin. Police arrived minutes later, their flashlights cutting through the rain-slicked hallway like blades of light. Officers in crisp uniforms sweeping the corridors with methodical precision, finding the entry door wedged open with a crumpled note bearing an unknown phone number and a cryptic message scrawled in faded ink. "Debts come due, secrets unearthed." They reviewed the grainy security footage in the building's cramped office, the screen flickering with static as it showed the hallway light activating alone, pulsing erratically, then 2 hooded figures approaching with unnatural fluidity, faces averted from the lens, movements jerky yet deliberate, as if not entirely corporeal. One pausing to whisper directly at the camera, the audio capturing a garbled hiss that the officers attributed to interference, though Alex heard his own name woven into the noise. Statements were taken in his dimly lit kitchen, the officers noting his pallor and the wrench still clutched in his hand. Their questions probing gently into his background, stirring more guilt as he omitted the family's secret, fearing judgment, while they uncovered no immediate trace of the men, only faint scuff marks on the stairs that led nowhere, dissolving into the shadows. The encounter left him unmoored, a blend of real-world threat and spectral horror that festered in his mind, prompting him to relocate weeks later to a sleek high-rise in downtown Chicago, seeking anonymity amid the throngs of strangers and the constant buzz of traffic that drowned out silence. Yet, the paranoia followed like a persistent shadow, guilt manifesting in insidious new ways, flickering lights in his new home that activated without motion, whispers in the elevator shafts at odd hours that carried his brother's voice, apparitions of hooded figures appearing in reflections on polished windows, their forms merging with spectral replicas of his family, eyes accusatory and unrelenting. One sleepless night, ensconced in his sterile new bedroom with curtains drawn tight, a knock echoed precisely at 1:27 a.m., 3 measured raps that pierced the quiet. And through the peephole, the pristine hallway stood empty. But the overhead light buzzed to life on its own, shadows coiling into familiar shapes that breathed accusations through the door, tendrils of darkness seeping under the frame like invasive fog. He ignored it at first, barricading himself behind furniture, but the whispers penetrated regardless. "Open, confess, or we'll take it all." Psychological torment peaked as guilt conjured full-fledged visions, the intruders materializing inside his apartment, their faces shifting fluidly to his brother's, hands outstretched in ethereal judgment, pulling him into a swirling void where past sins replayed in endless loops, the heirloom appearing in ghostly hands, its weight a physical burden on his chest. Alex sought therapy in desperation, sessions in a nondescript office where he attributed the hauntings to stress and unresolved trauma, But each confession unearthed deeper horrors, the supernatural taint clinging like a curse, manifesting during daylight hours as well. Shadows lengthening in his office cubicle, whispers and conference calls that only he heard, apparitions lurking in crowded subways, their eyes glowing, fixing on him amid oblivious commuters. The boundary between mind and malevolent blurred further one evening, when, alone in his high-rise, the power flickered, plunging him into darkness. And then knocks resumed, accompanied by scraping at the lock, voices outside murmuring his secrets aloud, drawing him to the door in a trance of guilt-fueled compulsion. He resisted, clutching the wrench like a talisman, but the entities pressed closer, their forms passing through walls, cold breaths on his neck whispering temptations of atonement through surrender. In those quiet moments of vulnerability, the apparitions return with renewed vigor, whispering invitations to confess or face eternal pursuit, blending raw fear with an insidious pull towards self-destruction, leaving him forever vigilant, the wrenched by his bed, a constant companion, haunted by the silent hallway's unyielding gaze that transcended buildings and cities. And though he fled the physical space, the shadows followed relentlessly, eternal sentinels of his fractured soul, ensuring every breath in the dark carried the echo of unpaid debts and unspoken truths.
True scary stories from the dead of night. The shadowed ridge, Emily had always been drawn to the rugged trails of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the ancient pines loomed like silent guardians and the morning mist wrapped the world in a veil of mystery. That fateful October day, she sat out alone on the forgotten Eagle's Crest path near Boone, North Carolina, after her best friend backed out due to a sudden storm warning. Locals in the small town spoke in hushed tones about the ridge, sharing old legends of wanderers who vanished into the fog, their echoes lingering as warnings to the unwary. Stories passed down through generations of families who lost kin to the unforgiving wilderness. Emily dismissed it all as folklore. She was a resilient graphic designer from Charlotte, equipped with a reliable GPS watch, energy bars, a sense of adventure that had carried her through tougher hikes, and a small journal where she sketched the landscapes that inspired her work. The air hung heavy with the scent of pine resin and wet soil, mingling with the faint, earthy aroma of moss-covered rocks. And as she ascended the winding trail, the forest seemed to swallow the sounds of the outside world, leaving only the rhythmic thud of her hiking boots against the packed earth, each step resonating like a heartbeat in the void. Birds that usually chattered from the branches fell silent, as if the woods themselves had imposed a vow of quietude, amplifying the isolation that pressed in from all sides. She pushed onward, the path narrowing between towering boulders and thick undergrowth, vines twisting like serpents around trunks that seemed to lean in closer with every passing minute. But soon, a nagging unease settled in her chest, a prickling awareness that she was not alone, as though the very air carried the weight of unseen scrutiny. It started subtly, a sensation of being observed from the dense thicket to her left, where shadows pulled deeper than the overcast sky allowed, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the dim light filtering through the canopy. She stopped once, twice, straining her ears, but heard nothing beyond her own shallow breaths and the distant creak of branches settling under their own weight. Convincing herself it was merely the solitude amplifying her imagination, the way loneliness could conjure phantoms from nothing, she continued, yet the feeling persisted, evolving into a certainty that something, or someone, was matching her pace, hidden just beyond the veil of leaves, its presence a cold draft against her neck. Paranoia crept in, unbidden thoughts of vulnerability surfacing, memories of a recent breakup, the guilt of harsh words left unresolved, the way she'd pushed people away in her pursuit of independence, making her question if this isolation was self-punishment, a deliberate plunge into the unknown to confront her inner demons. The trail hugged a precipitous drop-off where the ground fell away into a chasm littered with jagged rocks and tangled vines that snaked like veins across the exposed earth. And that's when the first anomaly pierced the silence, a faint rustling, not the wind, but deliberate footsteps paralleling her own, accompanied by a low, ethereal whisper that slithered through the air like smoke, evoking a deep-seated dread that stirred forgotten fears from childhood nightmares. Emily's pulse raced, her skin crawling as she whirled to face the source, but the woods stared back empty, save for branches that swayed unnaturally, as if stirred by an invisible hand, leaves fluttering without breeze, casting dancing shadows that mimicked human forms. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly, echoing into the void, without reply, only to be met with a subtle intensification of the whispers, as if her challenge had awakened something dormant. The whispers grew, forming fragmented words. "Lost. Join us. Your pain." They burrowed into her thoughts, stirring psychological turmoil, amplifying her inner guilt over past failures, the friend she'd let down years ago, the family ties she'd neglected in her busy life, the small betrayals that accumulated like stones in her chest, turning the hike into a mental labyrinth where every turn revealed another layer of self-doubt. Ahead, the trail curved sharply around a cluster of ancient oaks, their roots exposed like skeletal fingers grasping the soil. And in a fleeting glimpse through the foliage, she saw it. A spectral figure, gaunt and shrouded in ragged cloth that mimicked the bark of dead trees. Its form hunched low, eyes glowing with an unnatural luminescence that pierced the gloom like distant stars in a void. It moved with predatory grace, not walking but gliding, its elongated limbs ending in fingers that clawed the earth, drawing faint trails of shadow that lingered like ink stains on the forest floor. Tendrils of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. This wasn't human. It felt like a manifestation of the ridge's dark history, a supernatural entity born from the collective fears of those who tread here before. Perhaps the aggregated sorrow of lost souls trapped in eternal wander. Emily's mind reeled, paranoia blending with terror as the whispers invaded deeper. Your secrets, we know them all. The lies you tell yourself. She retreated a step, the chasm yawning invitingly to her right, its depths whispering temptations of escape. But the figure advanced, its shape flickering, edges dissolving into wisps of darkness that reformed with each blink, accompanied by illusory flashes of familiar faces, her ex, her estranged brother, morphing into the entity's grotesque visage. Desperation clotted her. She pulled out her phone, feigning a call with trembling hands, her fingers numb from the encroaching cold. "Hey Sarah, I'm nearing the Crest now. You spotting me from the overlook? Yeah, give a shout if you're there." She yelled upward, waving emphatically as if signaling a companion on higher ground, her voice laced with feigned confidence to mask the rising panic. The entity paused, its glowing gaze shifting spyward, the whispers fracturing into discordant murmurs, a cacophony of confusion that bought her a precious moment of hesitation, the shadows around it recoiling slightly as if repelled by the illusion of company. Seizing it, she darted forward, but the thing recovered swiftly, surging through the underbrush with inhuman speed, angling to cut her off at a narrow ledge where the trail pinched between rock and void. The ground slick with dew that made every step treacherous. Branches cracked under its pursuit, and a cold gust carried its rasping breath, laced with the scent of decay and something metallic, like old blood. And the whispers turned accusatory, dredging up vivid hallucinations. Apparitions of her ex, his face twisted in blame, floating amid the trees, joined by spectral images of her childhood home, burning with the guilt of unspoken apologies, fueling her disorientation and slowing her steps. She stumbled over a root, nearly tumbling into the abyss, where shadowy tendrils seemed to reach up from the depths, hungry and alive, coiling like smoke toward her flailing arms. Regaining balance with a desperate grab at a low-hanging branch, she pressed on, the figure emerging closer now, its hood slipping to reveal a visage that morphed, human features melting into a grotesque amalgamation of bone and vine, empty sockets weeping black ichor that dripped and sizzled on the leaves below. It lunged, spectral fingers grazing her arm, sending jolts of icy numbness that spread like poison through her veins, whispering promises of eternal rest in the ridge's embrace, a seductive lure that tugged at her weary soul. Emily screamed, twisting away, her cry a raw defiance that shattered the oppressive quiet, propelling her forward into the thickening mist that now enveloped the trail like a shroud, blurring the line between reality and the nightmare unfolding.
The scream tore from her throat, echoing off the ridge like a thunderclap, momentarily silencing the insidious whispers and scattering the hallucinatory visions that clawed at her sanity, leaving her with a fleeting clarity amid the chaos. Emily ran blindly, legs burning with exertion, the trail a blur of roots and stones that threatened to trip her at every turn, her mind a whirlwind of psychological torment, intertwined with the supernatural horror pursuing her, each stride pulling her deeper into a vortex of fear and self-recrimination. Guilt manifested as fleeting shadows darting at her periphery, spectral echoes of regrets that whispered accusations. Abandoned, forgotten, your fault. These weren't mere illusions. They felt tangible, brushing against her skin like cold fingers, amplifying the paranoia that she'd always carried, the fear of being unworthy, exposed in her solitude. She burst through a wall of brambles, thorns drawing blood that felt unnaturally cold against her skin, stinging with an intensity that mirrored her inner turmoil. And there, at the Crest's open plateau, a group of tourists milled about, snapping photos of the panoramic view over the rolling hills, their casual chatter a stark contrast to the dread coiling in her gut. Collapsing to her knees on the rocky outcrop, she gasped out her ordeal. Something's after me. Not human. Whispers. Shadows. Please help me. A burly man in a flannel shirt turned, concern etching his weathered face, and rallied the others to form a protective circle, one woman dialing emergency services on her phone while scanning the tree line with wary eyes, her voice steady as she reported a possible stalker in the woods. They waited, tense, as minutes stretched into an eternity, the group sharing water and reassurances, but no figure emerged, no glowing eyes, no whispers, only the wind rising, carrying a faint, mocking sigh that dissipated into the ether, leaving Emily to wonder if it had all been a product of her fracturing mind. As her adrenaline ebbed, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion, Emily accepted their company for the descent, the group moving as one, sharing stories of their own eerie experiences on the ridge to lighten the mood. Tales of strange lights at night, unexplained disappearances from decades past. Though her paranoia lingered, every snapped twig sending her heart racing, every shadow in the undergrowth evoking the entity's form. Midway down, as the path wound through a denser section of forest where sunlight barely penetrated, they discovered anomalies off the trail. Soil churned in swirling patterns that defied natural erosion, as if clawed by frantic hands, and footprints embedded deep, elongated with toes branching like twisted roots, trailing into a foreboding thicket where the temperature plummeted and faint apparitions flickered in the dim light, ghostly outlines that vanished when stared at directly. The man suggested it was a prankster, or perhaps a large animal like a black bear, his tone dismissive to ease the tension, but Emily sensed the truth. A supernatural residue, the entity's mark pulsing with malevolent energy that made her skin prickle anew, stirring fresh waves of guilt as she recalled how her skepticism had led her here, ignoring warnings like so many times before. The group pressed on, their footsteps synchronized, but Emily couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, the whispers returning faintly, carried on the breeze, teasing the edges of her hearing with promises of revelation. That evening, safe in her rented cabin on the outskirts of Boone, nestled among quiet pines that now seemed ominous, the terror refused to fade.
Shadows in the corners elongated unnaturally, stretching toward her like accusing fingers. And the whispers returned, softer but persistent, seeping through the walls like fog, murmuring secrets she'd buried deep. She barricaded the door with a heavy chair, lit every lamp to banish the darkness, but sleep evaded her, replaced by visions that blurred reality. The figure appearing at her window, its morphing face pressing against the glass, eyes boring into her soul, drudging up buried guilt over a childhood accident she'd caused, a sibling scar she'd never atoned for. The memory replaying in vivid detail, the crash of glass, the cries, the blame she'd internalized for years. Paranoia escalated. She paced the creaking floorboards, hearing knocks that echoed from empty rooms, soft thuds that mimicked a heartbeat, growing louder as midnight approached, accompanied by apparitions in the mirrors, reflections that didn't match her own, twisted versions with glowing eyes that whispered condemnations. In a moment of desperation, she grabbed her journal, sketching the entity frantically, but the lines came alive on the page, shadows bleeding from the ink, forming words, return, belong. The cabin felt alive, walls breathing with the rhythm of the ridge, supernatural forces seeping in, blending with her psychological scars until she could no longer distinguish fear from reality. Days blurred into weeks, and though she fled back to Charlotte, avoiding all trails, the entity's influence persisted. Whispers in crowded streets, shadows in her apartment that moved when she wasn't looking. Guilt manifested as nightly visitations, where spectral hands clutched at her throat, forcing confessions of her deepest regrets. One stormy night, alone in her bed, she heard the final call, a chorus of voices from the ridge, pulling her back, home, with us. She resisted, but the seed was planted, a psychological tether woven with supernatural threads, ensuring the shadowed ridge would forever haunt her. A reminder that some paths led not to freedom, but to the inescapable abyss of the self. And in the quietest moments, when the world slept, she still felt its gaze, eternal and unforgiving.
The lingering shade. Sarah had reluctantly agreed to attend the weekend gathering in a weathered Victorian house on the outskirts of Seattle's Capitol Hill, a neighborhood where fog often rolled in from Puget Sound, cloaking the streets in a perpetual haze that muffled sounds and hid secrets in its damp embrace. The old home, with its creaking wraparound porch and overgrown garden choked with ivy and forgotten relics, belonged to an acquaintance from her office, and though she preferred quiet evenings alone in her small apartment, the persistent invitations had worn her down, stirring a faint guilt over her growing isolation since the accident last year, the car crash she caused while distracted by her phone, injuring a close friend, a mistake buried under layers of denial that now festered in her subconscious like an untreated wound, whispering accusations in her quieter moments. Inside, the party thrummed with muffled laughter and the erratic thumping of music from a vintage stereo system, the air thick with the scent of spilled beer, damp wood, and the faint undercurrent of cigarette smoke wafting from hidden corners. But Sarah lingered near the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a lukewarm drink in a red plastic cup, the crowd's chaotic energy amplifying her unease and evoking flashes of the crash's chaos, bodies jostling like debris. As midnight slipped past unnoticed amid the revelry, the room grew stifling, heat from too many bodies pressing in, and she stepped out the back door for fresh air. The cool mist enveloping her like a shroud, carrying the sulky tang of the nearby sound that mingled with the earthy decay of fallen leaves scattered across the uneven lawn. The small backyard was enclosed by a tall wooden fence, weathered and splintered, beyond which lay a narrow alley shrouded in darkness, punctuated by sporadic streetlights that flickered like failing heartbeats, their glow diffused by the fog into hazy orbs.
Motion sensors above the door and garage cast intermittent pools of yellow light, their timers sluggish and unreliable, leaving swaths of shadow that seemed to breathe with subtle undulations, as if the night itself were alive and watching. At the yard's edge, near the fence, were vines twisted like skeletal fingers. A form materialized in the gloom, a tall silhouette, motionless and imposing, facing away, clad in a tattered overcoat that draped unevenly, as if weighted by unseen burdens hidden in bulging pockets. Sarah's pulse quickened. It resembled a man, but its unnatural stillness unnerved her, evoking the frozen pulse of her friend in the wreckage, a psychological echo that twisted her gut with fresh guilt, making her question if this was a manifestation of her buried remorse. "Are you okay?" she called softly, her voice swallowed by the fog, dissipating into nothingness. No response came, but as she edged closer, hesitant steps crunching on gravel, the alley light behind the figure sputtered on with a mechanical click, etching its outline in stark contrast, head tilted upward, as if attuned to whispers from the void beyond the fence, perhaps echoes of distant waves or something more sinister. The coat's fabric appeared sodden, clinging unnaturally to a frame that seemed too gaunt, and faint wisps of shadow curled from its hems like smoke rising from dying embers, defying the still air. "Do you need help?" she pressed, louder now, a tremor in her tone betraying the paranoia creeping in, memories of the crash surfacing unbidden, the screech of tires on wet pavement, the shattering impact, the lie she told investigators to shift blame onto road conditions. The figure rotated slightly, not fully, revealing no discernible face, only a pale hand rising slowly, palm outward in a gesture of hush, fingers elongated and bandaged, stained with dark smears that gleamed wetly under the erratic light, as if wrapped in haste after some unseen injury. The backyard light extinguished abruptly, plunging the space into a disorienting twilight where distances blurred, shapes shifting at the periphery like half-formed thoughts. Sarah reached back for the door handle, fingers brushing cold metal, but it resisted, locked from within, perhaps by a careless guest fumbling in the kitchen or some malevolent force manipulating the mechanism, the knob cold and unyielding under her increasingly frantic grasp. She rapped on the glass pane, the party's din absorbing the sound like a void, rendering her knocks futile, and when her eyes darted back to the fence, the figure had vanished, not retreated into the alley's depths, but dissolved into the mist as if absorbed by it, leaving only a lingering chill that seeped into her bones and stirred apparitions at the edge of her vision, ghostly outlines that whispered faint reproaches. Panic stirred deep within, an animal instinct urging immediate flight, and she vaulted the low porch railing, navigating the side yard toward the driveway gate, thorns from overgrown roses snagging her sleeves like accusing fingers clawing for attention, drawing pinpricks of blood that felt like penance. As her hand touched the rusted latch, the garage light flared suddenly, illuminating the narrow passage between structure and fence, where the figure reappeared, closer now, its coat torn at the seams with ethereal stuffing protruding like spectral innards exposed to the night, the bandaged hand lifting again in silent command, shadows coiling around it like living extensions. For the first time, a voice emanated, a whisper carried on the wind that cut through the fog. Quiet, your fault echoes. It wasn't aggressive, but corrective, as if silencing her inner turmoil in the chaos of the party, the words burrowing into her mind, amplifying guilt over the accident, conjuring apparitions of her injured friend flickering in the shadows, eyes accusatory and hollow, bandaged limbs mirroring the figures. Sarah's breath hitched. This wasn't merely an intruder, but something supernatural, a shade born of her regrets, manifesting in the fog to confront her denial. She unlatched the gate with trembling fingers, slipping into the driveway, walking briskly toward the street, resisting the urge to run, for haste felt like summoning pursuit, each step echoing unnaturally in the quiet. The road lay quiet under flickering lamps, houses hunkered in darkness with curtains drawn like closed eyelids, and she glanced back, seeing nothing but swirling mist, yet paranoia whispered of eyes watching from unlit windows, judging her escape. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she noted the battery at a precarious low, the screen glowing faintly as she summoned a ride. But the app lagged, freezing mid-load, when a vehicle approached from behind. Headlights dimmed to slits, engine humming softly like controlled breath, tires whispering over wet asphalt. She ducked behind a parked car in a nearby driveway, heart pounding against her ribs, watching it cruise past and halt near the party house, doors opening silently to release two figures, clad in dark attire, one in a familiar overcoat that hung askew, their movements synchronized and predatory, shadows trailing them unnaturally, elongating across the pavement as if alive and seeking. The garage light blinked on, casting their silhouettes in harsh relief, and Sarah's phone died abruptly, screen blackening like an omen, leaving her stranded in the enveloping mist that now felt suffocating, pressing in with accusatory weight. Whispers returned, not from the figures, but from within her head, insidious and personal. You caused this. Join the silence. No running from what you've wrought. Apparitions swirled in the fog, ghostly replicas of the crash scene materializing around her, twisted metal frames, spectral forms reaching for her with bandaged hands, blending psychological torment with the supernatural presence that seemed to draw the intruders closer, their gestures in unison, palms raised as if conducting Ningist itself.
The figures vanished around the side of the house, the gate creaking open in their wake like a reluctant invitation, and Sarah bolted from her hiding spot, weaving through neighboring yards where dew-soaked grass muffled her footsteps, the fog thickening like a living entity that clung to her clothes, carrying echoes of the whispers that now invaded her thoughts, dredging up vivid guilt, the moment of distraction behind the wheel, glancing at a text, the violent impact, the friend's cries she'd ignored in her panic to flee the scene mentally. She rang doorbells frantically along the row of silent homes, lights blooming in windows like reluctant eyes awakening, until a porch illuminated at the fourth house, an elderly woman peering out cautiously through a chain-locked door, her face etched with concern and sleep-disrupted lines, as Sarah stammered about intruders and unnatural shadows at the party nearby, her voice breaking with urgency. The woman ushered her inside without hesitation, the warmth of the home a stark contrast to the chill outside, the scent of chamomile tea lingering in the air as she dialed the authorities, offering a steaming mug that Sarah clutched with shaking hands, the steam rising like fleeting ghosts that dissipated into the cozy lamplight. Police sirens pierced the night soon after, cutting through the fog like beacons, officers arriving with flashlights that sliced through the mist, converging on the party house where music still pulsed obliviously from within, oblivious guests dancing in ignorance. They discovered the back door ajar, handles slick with an inexplicable residue, a window screen pried loose from a ground floor bedroom with tool marks that didn't match any standard implement, footprints embedded in the soft earth, elongated with odd smears as if from bandaged extremities dragging through mud, and faint handprints on the gate, glistening with an iridescent substance that evaporated under scrutiny, leaving only a faint, acrid scent. No one at the gathering had noticed the breach, the host insisting vehemently that the door was secured earlier. But Sarah knew better. The figures weren't mere burglars casing the place, but harbingers intertwined with her psyche, their supernatural essence leaving traces that defied logic. Shadows in the yard that lingered after the lights dimmed, whispering accusations only she could hear, blending with echoes of the crash. The officers took her statement in the flickering glow of the porch, their questions probing her presence at the party and her observations, stirring paranoia that they suspected her involvement somehow, guilt manifesting as apparitions in the corners of her vision, her friend's spectral form watching from the fog-shrouded alley, bandaged like the intruder's hands, eyes pleading for truth amid the lies she'd spun. Cleared to leave after what felt like an eternity of scrutiny, Sarah returned home to her apartment in the city's Fremont district, the drive a blur of rain-streaked windows and internal turmoil. But the shade followed, its presence insidious and unrelenting, lights in her hallway flickering without cause, whispers seeping from vents at odd hours. Shh, confess your sins. Paranoia escalated in the days that followed.
every shadow in her peripheral vision morphing into the overcoated figure, bandaged hands reaching from doorways and alcoves, invoking hallucinations of the accident replaying in mirrors, the car flipping in slow motion, glass shattering into crystalline shards, her friend's face contorted in pain, now blended with the intruder's silhouette, eyes glowing with supernatural judgment. One evening, alone in her dimly lit living room, with curtains drawn against the encroaching night, a knock sounded at her door, slow and deliberate, echoing like a heartbeat out of sync, and through the peephole, the corridor stood empty, but a chill draft carried the whisper, "Your silence ends now. Face what you've done." She barricaded herself in, piling furniture against the entrance, phone charged obsessively on the nightstand, but sleep brought vivid visions, the figures multiplying in her dreams, their coats unraveling to reveal voids that sucked in light and sound, pulling her into a realm where guilt became eternal torment. Apparitions of party guests twisted into judgmental specters, their voices a chorus demanding atonement through confession or oblivion. Therapy sessions offered no lasting respite, the psychologist attributing it all to post-traumatic stress and survivor's guilt. But Sarah felt the supernatural tether strengthening, shadows lengthening unnaturally in the office during appointments, whispers interrupting her confessions, blending her psychological scars with an otherworldly malice that fed on her regrets, growing stronger with each denial. Weeks later, during a stormy night, when thunder rattled the windows like distant accusations, the power outage plunged her apartment into absolute darkness, and the whispers swelled into a deafening murmur, figures materializing in the gloom, bandaged hands gesturing hush as they encircled her, their forms dissolving into mist that invaded her lungs, choking her with guilt-laden air that tasted of salt and regret. She fled to a friend's couch in desperation, seeking solace and company, but the shade persisted undeterred, appearing in dreams as a lingering presence at gatherings, ensuring she avoided crowds altogether. Her phone always charged to full, yet the paranoia remained, a constant, insidious companion, reminding her that some faults summoned shades that never truly departed, their whispers a perpetual echo in the fog of her mind. In quiet moments, the whispers returned, eternal echoes of that foggy night, binding her to an inescapable web of fear, remorse, and the unrelenting pull of unspoken truths.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more terrifying stories.